All right, it is 2 o'clock, so we'll get our webinar series started. I'm Tiffany Stanley. I would like to welcome you to GMA's webinar series. First, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items first before we get started. You entered into listen-only mode, and so we will open up the floor for questions after each presenter does their presentation. You should see on your screen a box for Q&A. Please feel free to type in any questions that you may have for the presenters in the Q&A box. And we also have the chat box that will be available for you as well. Once we do open up the floor for questions, if you have any questions, you can use the raise hand feature, and we can unmute you and allow you to ask your question live. All right, GMA is hosting a series of webinars to provide city officials with information about federal and state agency resources in response to COVID-19 and other natural disasters. The series will also include information to guide decisions that will facilitate moving cities forward in the coming year. Each webinar will feature brief presentations from state and our federal agencies. Today's webinar will feature GEMA representatives and would include information for Georgia officials about emergency response and preparedness, resilience for COVID and hurricane season, coordination of local and state resources, funding resources, and impacts to plans for evacuation shelters during a pandemic to comply with any phased reopening or executive orders. And we'll follow up with some updates on some grant availabilities for cities. In the webinar registration, you probably saw it was titled GEMA CARES Act. We will not be specifically discussing CARES Act on today. CARES Act is being administered through the state, so if you have any specific questions pertaining to CARES Act funding, please reach out to your member services consultant or either your representative for DCA. I would like to introduce our two speakers for today. Our first speaker will be Mr. Tim Reeves. Tim has more than 25 years of experience in the emergency management and homeland security field, and he currently serves as the Northwest Georgia Field Coordinator for GEMA Homeland Security. Prior to his current position, he served with Garden County, Georgia, as the Emergency Management and 911 Director. His previous experience also includes firefighting, EMS, law enforcement, and work in private industry. He's a past president of the Emergency Management Association of Georgia. Our second speaker is going to be Ms. Valerie Grooms. She is currently GEMA Homeland Security Public Assistant Department Manager. She has more than 24 years of experience with GEMA Homeland Security, primarily in the area of grants administration. During her tenure, she has served as Deputy Public Assistance Officer and Public Assistance Officer in several disasters. She has played an integral role in over 45 federal declarations and 12 state public assistance declarations totaling over $1 billion. I'll now turn the floor over to Mr. Tim Reeves, who will be our first presenter.
Okay, good afternoon. So this afternoon, I'm going to very briefly go over some important pieces of the emergency management plans, and also some response and recovery efforts that you guys can do both during an event and pre-event as well too. So first of all, some things you can do to get ready pre-event, some things that are extremely important. As many of you are currently working the COVID event now, you'll see that some of the things that I'm going to discuss today have definitely come into play during the COVID event, and some of the things that I will discuss are certainly applicable to natural disasters as well that could affect us. And as was mentioned earlier, what if something happens during the pandemic within your community? A hurricane, a tornado event. We've already experienced some of that in the state, and it does create some challenges. But how do we balance everything to still respond and recover from these events, even when a pandemic is going on? So we're going to talk about that, and certainly at the end, I'll be glad to take any questions that you may have. To begin with, I know that many of you on the call have already begun doing some of these things, but I encourage you, if you haven't, to go ahead and to get to work on that. But then, if you've already established some of these relationships we're going to talk about, I would encourage you to work to enhance those, and every chance you get to expand those relationships, because emergency management is truly about relationships. And if we can develop those relationships ahead of time, and again enhance those relationships, the better off we're going to be as we move forward and we have events that do affect our communities. So the first thing, working with the local emergency management director to identify hazards and threats. Extremely important. For years, we've been working with local governments and talking about what are the most likely events that could affect us. And I know that you guys, you do. There's things that probably keep you awake at night that you think about. Well, what if this happens, and how would we respond to that, and how would we bring our community to a point where we can recover from that? The big thing is we've got to sit down and we've got to be honest with each other. We've got to talk about the things that we feel like are the most likely that are going to happen. We need to start planning for those first. And this has to be an ever-evolving process, just because the threats change, the hazards change, our capabilities change. So we have to do that on a regular basis. So I would encourage you to do that. And as part of that, enhance or establish your relationship with the local EMA director and other partners. When a disaster strikes your community, there's going to be so many different partners that are involved. It's going to be extremely important for you to know those people on a day when the sun's shining, and get to know those people, develop those relationships, and have an understanding of what is out there. The EMA directors in each county, this is something that they do on a regular basis. So I would encourage you to plug in with them and to develop that as time goes on. The other thing is be a part of the local emergency operations plan process. The local emergency operations plan, it simply sets out and identifies who's going to be responsible for what during a local state of emergency. And during that local state of emergency, the local emergency operations plan goes into effect. And it's going to be important not only to be a part of the process, working specifically on the local emergency operations plan, but also to develop standard operating procedures that will make it possible for you to be able to meet those responsibilities that are outlined in that local emergency operations plan. So some other work that we can do pre-disaster. There's a sample ordinance regarding emergency management. It's on the Georgia Municipal Association website. That template, I encourage you, if you have not adopted that ordinance or some ordinance similar to that, to please take a look at that and to make plans in the near future to start work on that. That ordinance, we're going to talk a little bit about what those ordinances allow us to do. Very important during times of emergencies. And in the event that we're in right now, you'll see some things that kind of stand out during the COVID event, that it's going to be important for you to have that ordinance in place so that you can deal with some of these things more efficiently. Also, part of that ordinance regarding emergency management, there's a portion of that allows you to declare a local state of emergency, for the local governing body to do that, the local city to be able to do that. And that declaration of local emergency, what that does is it simply waves a flag. It lets the state, it lets the federal government know that, hey, we are experiencing an event that is taxing our resources, and we may need some extra help. It waves our hand and lets them know that those things are going on. Very important to understand that process and how that works. Beyond that local state of emergency, of course, you have a governor's state of emergency. You have a presidential disaster declaration, but all of those pieces begin with a local state of emergency. And we could spend several hours talking about the other parts of the process. I know Valerie will she'll highlight some of that, I'm sure, and talk about the recovery process and how some of those things work together. The other thing with that, again, it does activate that local emergency operations plan. With the local emergency operations plan, it brings the resources to the table that are needed to help you respond to and then ultimately recover from that event. So some of the other things that the ordinance regarding emergency management does for you: authority to waive procedures and fees. I'm sure that many of you, if you have an ordinance like this in place, you may have used that during the COVID event, simply because the supply chain issues that have taken place. And with that, you can waive some of your purchasing procedures. You can change some of your purchasing procedures. As you can imagine, that has been extremely important in this type of event. The other thing is to compel evacuation. I'm going to expand just a little bit on that. Of course, we're right in the height of hurricane season. I don't know if any of you have looked at the weather this morning, but it's definitely picking up, and there's a forecast by the National Weather Service that we're going to see a tremendous amount of named storms, and we just have to be ready for that. How does that all work together? If we do have to use this ordinance to compel an evacuation of our town or of our city, then at that point, how does that look during a pandemic? There is planning that has taken place. It continues to take place. It evolves every day, but there's a plan in place that will, for those people that you evacuate, those people would maybe not be in your traditional congregate type shelter. They may be in a different type facility, such as a hotel, motel, other facilities that allow for social distancing. And then again, in larger facilities where social distancing can occur in a congregate type sheltering situation. I'll be glad to answer any questions about that too. But again, this ordinance regarding emergency management, it's important to have that in place, whether we're talking about a hurricane evacuation, where we're talking about an evacuation for some other type of event. Extremely important to have that in place. And again, just to understand that there has been a lot of planning put in place that will allow for sheltering during this time that we're in. Another thing it allows for is registration of building and repair services. If any of you have ever experienced a tornado locally, you have ran into this, I'm sure, where people from out of town come in to provide services within your community. A lot of them are, their heart's in the right place, and they're there to help. They're there to make a little money. But there are those outliers that aren't there for the best reasons. So what this allows you to do, that registration of building and repair services, it allows you to gather information from these people that are coming in to work in your community, to be able to identify them, and then also to be able to track them down if they do have some business practices that are not above board. And so, very important in that situation, a very important piece to protect your citizens and protect your community. The other thing is, and this is always one that kind of gets thrown to the forefront, but it allows for curfews and closures. There are some very important times where curfews are needed and extremely important, and closures are extremely important. Of course, we've seen some situations like this here recently. With those curfews, you have to be very careful how we word those curfews. Simply, we want to protect the citizens, protect property, but we also want to allow recovery. So we don't want to harm businesses that are part of the recovery process in that as well too. So we have to be real careful with that. Next thing is the statewide mutual aid agreement. We push out the statewide mutual aid agreement every several years for a renewal. That statewide mutual aid agreement, it's not your everyday mutual aid and public safety mutual aid agreement. This is more for disaster specific processes. Think public works or building, planning, zoning. Think about those type things when you are thinking about a statewide mutual aid agreement. This statewide mutual aid agreement is something that is very important in that not only in the response process, but then in the recovery process, because some of the things that Valerie's going to talk about on the PA side, you must have some of these agreements in place to be able to take advantage of that. So when we talk about response and recovery, we talk about the local emergency operations center. Make sure that you support that local emergency operations center. That's going to be the hub for disaster response and recovery within the community, and it's very important to be a part of that local emergency operations center when it's activated. The other thing I was going to talk about is resource request, simply to make things more efficient, cut down on duplication of resources. All of the resource requests need to go back through that local emergency operations center or the local emergency management director to then come to GEMA. If it's not able to be filled locally, then that could come back to our agency, to the state operations center, to be filled. That process takes place through Web EOC, which is simply a web platform that we use to manage not only resources but to manage the event as well too. And each county local emergency management agency has access to that, and also they can make access to your organization and to your cities as well. Rapid needs assessment, very important. The picture over there on the right is actually from Seminole County during Hurricane Michael. Very important to get a good, quick, rapid needs assessment, especially when there is as much damage and devastation as there was after Hurricane Michael. Very important to get out there, to have a plan in place for that, to work together with all of your partners to quickly identify what your needs are and identify what resources, personnel, equipment, whatever you're going to need to be able to recover. Continuity of operations, I have to mention that for a moment. Of course, with the COVID response, that has been tremendous. We've learned a lot of things we can do without being face to face. We've had to modify some things throughout the state to be able to be more efficient with that. But that is extremely important. The work that cities do is very important, and those things that are priorities that have to get done, we have to have a plan in place for those things to continue. So I would encourage you to plan ahead for that. The other thing is damage assessment. Damage assessment is more looking at what the level of damage is. Different from the rapid needs assessment. The rapid needs assessment is looking to determine what resources you need. The damage assessment is looking to see what the impact is. And I encourage you to be a part of that within the community, and to have folks trained to be able to assist with that. And local emergency management agency can set that up, and we can help with that training as well too, if you have those needs. Debris planning. Of course, when we're talking natural disasters, debris can be a huge undertaking. But having a plan in place ahead of time for that, and making sure that that is coordinated locally, can't be stressed enough, because getting the community back open, making the initial push to get debris out of the roadway, but then also what's our long-term plan for debris removal with that as well. With that, I'll leave you with the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have, and I'll turn it back over to you guys.
All right, we'll open up the floor. Does anyone have any specific questions at this time for Tim concerning his presentation? Tim, I will ask one question. I know you mentioned the local emergency operations plan and example one that GMA has. Is there any particular adjustments that cities may need to make dealing with the new pandemic that we're facing compared to some of the things that they probably faced in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, I know that people are extremely busy right now, but, you know, right now we need to be documenting any things that we identify, that areas that we need to work on, whether it be in the local emergency operations plan, or it may be something that we need to add or adjust within the emergency management ordinance. Those things right now, while it's fresh on our mind, I'm sure there are things that we could look at to identify that could be enhanced there.
Yeah. And who are some key players that you feel needs to be at the table when a city is developing a plan?
Sure. Really, it's broad, because I think it's important for any department. Of course, your public safety departments extremely important in this, but then there's really no department that is not affected by disaster, and that's been obvious in the COVID environment that we're working in. You know, it's obvious when a community is affected by a natural disaster. So, you know, I think you need to bring as many people to the table as you can to start the planning process. And then as time goes on and you narrow that down, you know, you may pull certain people to finalize those plans, but it's important to bring as many people to the table as possible.
Okay. Let's see, we have another question. Would the emergency operations plan be county-wide if EMA is a county agency?
The local emergency operations plan is countywide, and again, it's very important because everybody has responsibilities within that plan. So it's important for the cities to be a part of that planning process, and to reach out to the local emergency management director if they haven't been a part of that process, and to get involved in that.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move on to our next presenter, Ms. Valerie Grooms. And remember, if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A or either our chat box, or you can raise your hand to be able to ask the question live. So, Ms. Valerie.
Thank you. And I won't reintroduce myself since I was introduced at the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about things you need to know before disaster, and especially now in a COVID environment. So I think that's going to require a little bit more thinking and planning prior to an event. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we get funding assistance for recovery. What is public assistance? When are we eligible for the funding? So what is public assistance? The public assistance program is supplemental assistance to state, local governments, and certain private nonprofit organizations for response and recovery in a presidentially declared disaster or event. So in public assistance, we deal strictly with FEMA funds, FEMA and state funds, but it's a FEMA disaster. So for instance, in this current event, there are several streams of funding out there for COVID, but in my division, we're just dealing with FEMA eligible costs. So a lot of costs that has been incurred in the COVID event is eligible costs under the CARES Act funding, but it's not eligible under FEMA funding. And the state of Georgia is, of course, requiring all applicants to go through FEMA to get FEMA funding and then be reimbursed for your 25% non-federal share and other costs that's not eligible under our program through the CARES Act funding. We're going to focus on how to prepare for an event. Once the big event hits, follow your plan, which Tim has discussed in detail already. We're going to talk a little bit about preliminary damage assessments as it relates to public assistance, cleanup, and the enforce account versus contract work. So we have several categories of work, and this is very important for us when preliminary damage assessments are being completed. We like for you to separate out your estimated costs by category. So as you can see, category A is debris removal, category B is search and rescue, category C is roads and culverts. Category D is your dams. Category E are your buildings and equipment. Category F are your utilities. And category G are parks, recreation, and anything else that doesn't readily fit into the other categories. So Tim already talked about plans, but whenever there's a huge event, debris is always a huge issue. And in Hurricane Matthew, it was crazy. So it's very important to have your debris plan in place prior to an event, one that defines essential personnel and agencies and outlines the actions necessary to execute a debris removal and disposal operation. Your plan should include a mission, organization, concept of operations, responsibilities, pre and post disaster actions, and mutual aid agreements if necessary. You should also develop a list of available contractors, develop sample contracts, and review local ordinances, just as Tim mentioned, define right-of-ways, curfews, and load limits. Be as detailed as possible so that when the event happens, it's just a matter of carrying out what you already have in your plan. Now, as far as contractors, and we're going to talk a little bit more about contracts later because you will have to bid them out at some point. But when the event happens, you can use your contractors that you have developed the list of and pre-qualified for like the exigent period, maybe the first 72 hours, and then after that, you will have to bid out your contracts. You want to review your local, state, and federal regulations. And in order to get that federal dollar, you're going to really need to understand and really what FEMA requires, because FEMA may require a whole lot more than what your state and local requirements are. So to get that federal dollar, you got to at least make sure that you're following federal guidelines as well as your state and local guidelines. You got to review your environmental regulations, coordinate with agencies or departments to develop a waiver procedures to expedite emergency operations. Show critical routes on your maps to prioritize debris clearance. Develop site selection criteria checklists in identifying potential storage sites. And again, develop your mutual aid agreements. We do have a statewide agreement, but you may want to have agreements with the counties and your adjoining cities. So you may want to look at that as well. Another thing you may want to look at, if you have a small city, you may want the county to handle your debris removal. That's something you may want to think about now and get with the county so that they can put that in their plan and all of your agreements can be in place with them in case an event happens. Your mutual aid agreements need to be in writing before an event occurs. It should outline the responsibilities of each party, and it should include general types of costs that may be used. So when an event takes place, respond, put your plan into effect, monitor calls on a map, clear major roads, identify immediate threats, start collecting documentation. I'm going to say that over again. Start collecting documentation. Our program is documentation intensive. You can never have too much. Take pictures, videos, any and everything that you can do. And the one thing with debris removal, because you have to start picking that up almost immediately, even before we get a declaration, you got to make sure that you understand what FEMA is going to require in order to reimburse you for your debris removal. You got to be able to quantify your debris. You got to have debris monitors. I've seen, and again, in Hurricane Michael, it has been a nightmare because a lot of applicants' costs were not approved because they did not follow the federal requirements for debris removal. So make sure that you understand what all is required and that you're capturing everything that FEMA will need in order to reimburse you. For example, leaners and hangers on trees, make sure you're counting those. Just taking pictures, because whenever there's an event, even when you're collecting debris from residents, they start bringing stuff from their backyard or from out in the field, all kinds of stuff. So you just got to make sure that you're picking up eligible debris and that it's just being properly documented. So the more documentation that you have, the better. Start assessing needs and prepare for PDA teams. So when preliminary damage assessments are done, they are first done at the local level. It's very important that you all let us know what's going on in your county, in your city, because if you don't tell us at the state, then we don't know. And typically you will provide this information to your emergency management EMA director. And we usually want this stuff immediately. And sometimes you all are still responding to the event. But if you could kind of identify somebody that could get that information to us, it would be appreciated. So it comes from a local level, and then you have your state and federal, local, state, and federal preliminary damage assessments. If we think that you have enough damage in your county, then we will come out, and in a COVID environment, it may be done electronically. But we do preliminary damage assessments as a group, and then you may have several that are going on in your county, so you may want to look at that as well, because if there's individual assistance, and then there's public assistance, and then you may have SBA also out there doing preliminary damage assessments. It's very important that you all get as much information on your costs as you can, or what you think your estimates are. And they don't have to be perfect, but they need to be as close as possible. In order for you to be declared, your county has to meet a threshold, and it's based on the 2010 per capita. For this FY20, it has to be $3.84 per county. So in order to get this, it's very important that you get all your costs together and look at every entity within the county and within the city, because you got your private nonprofits, you have your schools that get left out. That's your colleges and your elementary schools. They may have damage. Your churches may have damage. So you got to just think outside the box and submit any and all damage that has been incurred in your area. So that's very important. And again, just remember the different categories of work that I mentioned earlier, because we like to get it by category. Because sometimes disasters are declared by category. They may just declare an emergency declaration, which would just be categories A and B, debris removal and emergency work. For example, with COVID, it's only a category B event. None of the other categories are eligible in this event. So that's very important to know. You got to notify the public of any and everything. You got to have a person that can go out there and be the face for you, because that's how, if not, misinformation gets out. But you want to have schedules for pickup, any restrictions or penalties on illegal dumps, advise them of any local policies. Public information is very important in an event. So force account are your own employees. It's readily available. They have better knowledge of the area. For emergency work, only overtime is reimbursed if that's your policy. So we're always going to want to see your personnel policy, and we're always going to want to know about insurance. And these are things, if you've ever been involved in an event and used the FEMA grants portal, you can go ahead and upload that information so that it can already be there. And if you haven't ever been involved in an event and you're an eligible applicant, you can get access to the grants portal. You just need to make a request to us. And at the end of this, at my very last slide, there's a email address where you can request that. But the thing with using forced account labor is it takes them away from their regular work. So you may want to look at hiring temporary hires or a contractor for work that needs to be done. Those are some things to consider. And then whenever there's an event, you always have consultants too that that will work with you as well. But when dealing with consultants, really consider whether you really need a consultant. It may be something, especially if it has something to do with paperwork, pulling together paperwork and things like that. You can just hire a temporary person to assist you with that, because consultants, typically their per hour rate is very, very high. And sometimes you may or may not be reimbursed all of the costs depending on how much their hourly rate is. On the contracts, 100% of your costs are eligible. It doesn't matter which category of work that they're working in. So if you got a debris removal contract, then they're going to get 100% of their costs. Whereas if it's your own force account labor, you get the FEMA 75%, and typically the state would kick in 10%. So you would still have a local share. Whereas if you do contract, you get 100% of your eligible costs. It'll free up your regular personnel. And as I said earlier, you have to have a monitor. That's a requirement. You have to have a debris monitor. You have to follow your regular or emergency bid procedures. You have to bid the workout. That's very important. It must be bid correctly. And typically you take the low bid unless you have a very, very good reason for not taking the low bid, which you have to justify. And sometimes we don't have necessarily a debris team, but there's always, FEMA will usually provide some assistance with debris. When developing contracts for debris removal and disposal, you need to look at the characteristics of your debris, quantity of the debris, where is it located, the number of homes, facilities, and established damaged or destroyed, miles of road affected, and are there some roads that are still inundated with water. And sometimes you have to wait until just that water recedes, because it's hard to, especially in terms of giving an estimate of cost until the water recedes. There are 3 types of contracts. There are your time and material contracts, your lump sum contracts, and then your unit price contract. Time and material contracts are acceptable for the first 70 hours after the disaster, and that was what I was saying in the exigent period. Try to ensure competitive pricing. It should clearly state the price of equipment. It should specify a dollar cap, ceiling, or not to exceed amount. And you must closely supervise this contract. You must document actual hours of operators and equipment usage. Then you have your lump sum contract that establishes one contract price, one item bid from contract. It must have a clear, definable scope of work, minimum supervision. Contractors shoulder most of the risk, and it should document quantities in case of discrepancies. Then you have your unit price contracts that use line item costs to determine contract amount. The scope of work has to be clearly defined by actual measurements. An accurate account of debris removed. It must be closely monitored. Trucks should be measured and numbered, and you must keep good documentation. So if you decide to use your own force account labor, just be sure to document your regular time and your overtime costs. And your fringe benefit rates are eligible for regular and for overtime costs. Even though regular time may not be eligible under categories A and B, we still want to see the regular and overtime costs, because all of your equipment hours are eligible, but they cannot exceed regular and overtime hours. So we compare your regular and overtime hours to your equipment hours, and that's why we need to see both. Now for category C through G, you get reimbursed for your regular and your overtime hours. Document all of your materials that are used, have your invoices, if you have copies of cancel checks or proof that you paid it. If you pull materials from your existing inventory, just have some type of invoice showing whether it was purchased previously. But again, as I said earlier, everything has to be documented. Make sure any of your contracts includes eligible costs for reimbursement. Make sure that all of your costs include tipping fees, load tickets, and monitoring. Your monitoring fees are usually no more than 3% of the contract. If it's going to be more than that, just be able to justify that. Talk a little bit about our payment process. So our projects that are small projects, we pay all of those funds up front. So for instance, if you have a project worksheet that's maybe $100,000, that for us is considered a small project. So you would, once those projects are approved and obligated with FEMA, you will receive 100% of the state and federal share up front. We consider projects that are large project. I think for this year, it's like anything over $134,000 is considered a large project. So anything over that is funded at, we would advance you to 25% at your request of the approved fund. You can always request progress payment to get additional costs. In order to get a progress payment, you got to have cancel checks, invoices, and other documentation. Always make sure you stay within the scope of work of a project. If the scope of work changes, you need to let your grant specialist know. Right now, we have 10 grant specialists that work with the state of Georgia. So anytime that you need to reach out to somebody or find out who your grant specialist is, you can just contact my office and we'll let you know. This FEMA Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide is very important. There is one that's out that's for January, that came out January 2020 that has a few changes to it. But you can access it through the FEMA website at fema.gov, and you can just put in PAPPG and it'll pull up the most recent copy. It'll give you information, again, like I talked about, debris removal and some other aspects or requirements of the program in terms of eligibility and things like that. It's just a wealth of information if you need to know something. A lot of times when I'm getting calls or a lot of questions when we have an event, I'm having to refer to this to get an answer for you. So if you just kind of keep this on your desktop, you can just go, and it's interactive, which is why they recommend not printing it out. But you can get a lot of information just out of the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. And so after everything is said and done, compile your after action report, make any adjustments that you need to your plans. And if you feel like it, have your big old celebration. We've done that many times once we've closed disasters. So if you need any information or have any questions after this, you can just send an email to publicassistance@gema.ga.gov, and we can answer any questions that you have. And you can also refer to our website, GEMA's website, for additional information about the agency as a whole, as well as public assistance. And that concludes my presentation. I can take questions.
Thank you, Valerie. We did receive one question in the Q&A regarding eligibility of salary of personnel. The question is, what about salaried personnel that have to work 24 hours a day due to an emergency?
That again goes back to what's your policy? What's in your personnel policy? If it's in your personnel policy to reimburse them, then they can be reimbursed. So that's why it's very important, and that's why FEMA also always requests a copy of your personnel policy, and it has to be in effect prior to an event.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I see in the Q&A. Are there any additional questions? You can put those in the chat or pop them in the Q&A.
And while we're waiting on that, Ms. Valerie, if you have a city that comes in to assist you with cleaning up after a disaster, can you apply for reimbursement for their personnel and equipment costs? And if so, what type of documentation do you have to keep up with?
So that sounds like that would be mutual aid. If they're assisting another city or another county, they would submit a bill to the requesting entity. They would submit a bill to them, and then they would be responsible for reimbursing them for the work that they did. And then that particular entity would get with FEMA to get reimbursement under the mutual aid agreement.
Okay. And you mentioned as far as gathering estimates when you do have a disaster, what's the timeline as far as that? I think PDA having to be turned in.
Oh, we were on it yesterday. I'm serious. We be calling you the same day trying to get estimates, because as soon as we can get some type of estimate, that lets us know the magnitude of the event. Because again, we don't know unless you call us. I know we had we call them the Albany tornadoes. People were saying that we were being preferential to Albany, but they weren't calling us and letting us know what was going on. We had no clue that for a while. The communication wasn't available, so they have to. The entities have to communicate with us. That's the only way we're going to know what's going on out there. So it's very important. And my thing is, even if you don't think you have enough, I think it's a good idea just to request a PDA, because you never know. You have to consider like your EMCs. A lot of times they'll get a county over the threshold amount, because if there were a lot of power outages and things like that, your EMCs can put you over.
And we will make the recording and the slides available after the event.
Yes, we'll post the presentation on GMA's website, and we will make sure we provide a link to where that can be found. All right. If there's no other questions, we'd like to thank our presenters, Mr. Tim Reeve and Ms. Valerie Grooms, for participating in our webinar today and providing us some great information, preparing our cities for natural disasters and what you need to do to prepare. So document. It's the
yes.
definitely one of the ones that I got out there, and you can't start that process soon enough. GMA has developed some documentations preparing to request state and federal reimbursement after a disaster. So if you are interested in that particular document, we provide some links to GMA and FEMA's website, to the different documentations, work logs that you can use as far as keeping up with any information that you may have. But I've had the pleasure of working through 2 disasters and keeping up with all that documentation. And so the first one, it was a little confusion, but by the second time, I had all documentations and it was categorized just as it needed to. So anytime you need an assistance, please feel free to reach out to any of your member services consultants and any of your GEMA representatives as well. Again, thank you.
Yes, I want to piggyback on the documentation again. It helps you get your funds quicker if you have everything organized and in order, where it's easier to follow. You would not believe the stuff that we get sometimes. So just keeping that in mind. And a lot of that has to do, there's turnover sometimes in between, because events can go on, or the reimbursement process can go on for several months to years. So I think it's a very good idea to just have something in place that if there is somebody that new that comes in, they can easily follow the process.
All right. Again, thank everyone for participating. And that's the end of our webinar. Have a great day.